Hi, I'm Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and in this role, I'm serving as the host for NSC AI's podcast series on the Commission's work. This is the fifth of 6 episodes looking at the Commission's third quarter recommendations to Congress. This week, we talked to Chris Darby, an NSC AI commissioner and CEO of In-Q-Tel, the CIA-backed tech investment company, about the Commission's recommendations that AI for national security be extended to biotechnology and that biodata be considered an instrument of national power. I hope you find the conversation as fascinating as I did. Chris, generally we begin by having you introduce yourself, give us some of your background, what you're doing at In-Q-Tel, and how you came to the commission.
Sure. Well, first of all, Craig, thank you very much. Let me start by saying what an honor it is to be serving on this commission alongside such an esteemed group led by Eric Schmidt and Bob Work, and of course staffed by an incredibly dedicated and talented group of staff supporting the commission. It's been a real pleasure thus far. I came to the commission appointed by Senator Warner. My day job, I've been with a company called In-Q-Tel for the last 14 years as the CEO. We're the investment arm of the United States intelligence community doing early stage investing. Prior to that, I grew up in technology, primarily in the telecommunications and computing space.
You must have followed Gilman, is that right? Was he the CEO before you at In-Q-Tel? Wasn't he CEO at In-Q-Tel?
Gilman was early at In-Q-Tel. I did not follow Gilman directly into the job.
I see. Your line of effort begins this quarter's recommendations with a call to use AI for large-scale biotechnology research and innovation. I've spoken to people before about AI and biotechnology, but I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how AI will drive new innovations in biotech. And why did the Commission choose to take a specific in-depth look at AI and biotechnology?
Sure. Well, AI is really all about its application to adjacent technologies. And with bio, I think we're probably seeing the beginning of the next big tech revolution. It really begins with the fact that biology's become programmable, whether it's plants, animals, humans. We're getting to the point where biology can be treated as a set of ones and zeros that can be edited the same way a computer program can be edited. And so AI is really the key to enhancing our understanding of these core biological processes and enabling transformational breakthroughs. And Craig, really, the power of this biological intersection set with things like AI can impact health, food, environment. All of these things going forward can really change the way we live on a day-to-day basis. Really, by some estimates, it's an incredibly powerful tool. Some numbers would suggest that 60% of physical inputs to the economy will be produced with SynBio going forward. And so the U.S. has really got to maintain leadership in biotech and ensure that its biotech and AI strategies are really mutually reinforcing.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the 60% of physical inputs in the economy coming from synthetic biology? Just give an example for listeners so they can visualize that.
Sure. Well, we're dealing with situations today where we're trying to optimize crops for production with less water, for example. And so you can engineer a crop where it is actually consuming less water than it once did. And of course, there are great environmental reasons for wanting to do things like this. We are seeing production of actually materials based on biology. There are companies out there, I believe Ginkgo Bioworks in Boston, doing really some leading edge things about taking, for example, yeast and using that as a baseline to generate other products.
That's fascinating. I've had Alan Asperu and some other people on the podcast talking about new materials through biotech. You also call for reducing reliance on Chinese entities for large-scale genomic research databases, and you recommend widening the definition of biological threats in the National Biodefense Strategy to include biodata advantages as an instrument of national power. Can you talk about that threat? It sounds as though you're referring to something specific.
Well, I think if we start with the code of life being programmable and data being the new oil, it's all about how much of this data can you amass. We've got to go into that with our eyes wide open. Biotech is dual use. And there's a dark side to the potential of the intersection set of AI applications to bio. And the Commission cites three main threats, one strategic and really two are operational. The strategic threat is that biotech is an instrument of national power. It can be a projection of power. And for example, withholding access to either key technologies or drugs could impact another nation's state. Strategic benefit could be gained through the economic growth derived from the foundational bio-innovations. And really, you could see a situation where one nation was advantaged, for example, in the area of health, to the detriment of everyone else in the world. We just need to understand that it is, at the strategic level, an instrument and a projection of the power of a nation. At the more tactical operational level, really, I think there are two things that the Commission concerns itself with. One would be engineered pathogens. We've seen, I think, Craig, the devastation that can be caused economically and physically from an organic pandemic. Can you imagine if something was engineered for lethality? It just is a concerning situation, one that keeps me up at night much more even than the nuclear threat. I think that it's something that we as mankind will need to deal with. And then there are somewhat lesser areas like human enhancement. Should we engineer better humans, stronger humans, taller humans? That sort of area is an area that is a concern for the Commission because there are ethical and value conversations that have to go on. So I think what the Commission is recommending is really that we have to recognize that China's AI and biotech strategies are mutually reinforcing. And of course, they have very good reasons that I referred to earlier for investigating these areas and moving forward in these areas, but there is a dark side. So we're recommending updating the National Biodefense Strategy to include bio-related threats that can be enabled with AI. We just think it's the prudent thing for us to do from a national security perspective.
Yeah, and I understand the confluence of biological threats and AI. There are man-made viruses. You can synthesize a virus in the lab, for example. Just on the first point of the economic advantage or the medical advantage of having biologically engineered drugs that could help one country or give one country an advantage over another. It sounds like you're talking a little bit about the hunt for the vaccine with COVID-19. Did that inform this recommendation at all?
I don't think vaccine production specifically informed the recommendation as much as it was a macro level recognition that the next tech revolution is going to be bio. And that the intersection set of AI and bio will transform economies and societies going forward. And I think the Commission rightly said that we have to look at the application of AI in the area of bio as being an instrument of nation-state power, of national security concern, and really of the concern of mankind going forward. And so when we get into questions like whose value systems and so on are being applied to these things, we need to take it very seriously.
And using the term biodata as opposed to biosynthesis or some other term, why is data the focus as opposed to processes or outcomes?
Well, I think in AI and generally speaking in the data sciences, if you have more and diverse data sets, you can train your algorithms and you can gain insights at a higher fidelity than you can with less data. Sparse data is just more challenging. And so to the extent that you have more data, you have more opportunity. And if you have diverse data, you have a wider aperture of things that you can be addressing. And so we believe that data is really the foundation upon which you apply your AI. And to the extent that you can amass large amounts of that data, it gives you advantage. The other thing I would say is that we've traditionally talked about biodata within the context of genomics. And I think as sequencing got cheap, the genomic collection got aggressive by some people. And We're equally seeing now that, for example, things like brainwaves and patterns of brainwaves could be a data set that is collected. So anything that is being derived from a human being or an animal or a plant can be collected, and then tools can be applied to edit or understand those targets.
And when you say include biodata in the National Biodefense Strategy, you're talking about preventing the collection of biodata from American citizens or allies, or protecting the biodata of American citizens or allies?
Well, I think what we're talking about is, first of all, the ethical use of biodata. And I think to the extent that there are laws around privacy that we believe in here in the United States and that our allies believe in, I think we've got to understand what those laws say and what our general societal tolerance is for our genetic makeup to be made available for people who have these intents. And one of the things that I think we're most worried about is just the fact that a lot of China's work in these areas, and that the BGI in particular, the Beijing Genomics Institute, what they're doing with this massive data set is just opaque to us. We don't know. We do know that they're collecting both domestically, aggressively, and around the world now. And the information they're collecting around the world is going back to China. As I said before, these data sets are dual use. We want a healthier population. We know that the costs associated with healthcare going forward are going to be high here in the United States and in China. And so to the extent that we can understand the genome and we can create a healthier world, I think that's a good thing. But as I said earlier, there's a dark side to all of this too. And I think transparency is important in these areas. And I think standards and value systems are important in these areas. And this has got to be a conversation that goes on. I think the Commission recognizes that and is just trying to highlight that it starts with data.
On BGI, can you talk just a little bit more about who they are and what kind of research they're engaged in, the biodata collection that they're engaged in?
Sure. The Beijing Genomics Institute is really the de facto Chinese national champion in data sequencing and research. They're the big dog in terms of what China's doing on the biodata and research perspective. We don't have a lot of clarity on what they're doing, but here's what we do know. We know that the Chinese government is interested in collecting massive amounts of data and making a database of DNA info, for example, I think they've got 700 million Chinese men in the data set. We know that they're also collecting internationally. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has given them an opportunity to put facilities around the world and collect in the name of trying to be of assistance on the pandemic. But BGI also runs China's national gene bank. And so when we look at that collection, we think, well, okay, beyond the pandemic, what are they doing with it? We also know that they're subject to China's cybersecurity laws that require them to share data with the intelligence and national security apparatus. And I think that, of course, that whole family of laws and the intersection set between China's commercial interests and the interests of their intelligence and national security apparatus gives the Commission pause. We know that BGI has received, for example, substantial loans from China's government. And not surprisingly, there's some evidence that suggests that they work reasonably closely with the PLA. So BGI may be serving wittingly or unwittingly as a global collection mechanism for China's government in enhancing that national genetic data set that they could use in a variety of different ways.
Yeah. There's a whole conversation to be had about biodata and its potential uses. The Commission recommends announcing a set of specific use cases for quantum computers to help spur private sector investment and innovation in transforming quantum technologies. Can you give some examples of possible use cases specifically for national security?
Sure. And let me start by saying I'm not a quantum expert. To the extent that I am on the Commission, I've been listening to the people that are much smarter than I am on these subjects. The private sector works best when they're given a challenge. The private sector loves to innovate around a challenge. And if you look at the application of AI and quantum, the U.S. military's got big challenges that could be addressed. And so things like supply chain operations, could potentially be optimized using quantum, and pre-positioning of different resources or where they need to be pre-positioned could be anticipated using quantum more quickly and in a probably more accurate way than classical computing. We also know that quantum computers could be used to simulate atomic reactions inside a nuclear reactor on the power grid, or maybe even a nuclear weapon. But the fact is that we need to just throw out some of these different areas and let people iterate on them. Let them see where quantum can be applied, where it will work, where it won't work. Quantum is still in its infancy. And I think the best way to get the private sector involved is to give them a couple of challenges and say, optimize my supply chain. Show me how this is going to work. And I've got a lot of faith in the United States creative innovation engine. I think they will come up with things that we can't even imagine as commissioners.
Yeah, it just seems a little early because quantum computing has really only been shown to work theoretically. I mean, the Google quantum supremacy exercise, has created a lot of controversy about what exactly that means. To apply quantum computing to specific problems, I mean, you have to first make a quantum computer that can compute. And you recommend making quantum computing accessible to researchers via the National AI Research Resource. We've talked about the resource before, but maybe you can explain again to listeners that haven't heard previous episodes what the National AI Research Resource is, and then talk about why you think it's not premature to talk about making quantum computing accessible or setting challenges for the private sector.
Well, Craig, let me flip the order here. Let me start by saying why it's important to get involved now. I think that whether we're talking about gate-based quantum or adiabatic quantum, I think that the technology is evolving, and it's really about the number of error-corrected qubits that any particular platform are delivering at one point in time. And arguably, you need to get to approximately 100 error-corrected qubits before things get really interesting in quantum. But that said, there's certain sensitivity to that estimation. So what could we do with a lesser number than 100 of error-corrected qubits? And I think that's really the question that we as a commission are trying to encourage people to explore. And so the National AI Research Resource, the NAIR, that the commission recommended in Q1 would really provide researchers with access to compute resources, government data sets, educational tools, support to try and begin to interrogate the existing quantum computers, such as they are. They're not at the level of error-corrected qubits that we believe you need to be really relevant going forward on some of these problems. But we might be wrong. There may be things that we can do at hybrid computing environments where you combine classical with quantum resources at a lesser than 100 qubit level to make inroads. And so really our basic message is that the United States needs to lead basic quantum research, but it risks falling behind in applying this quantum computing to the national security use cases if we are so focused on a really exquisite use case and if we delay in giving these creative people access. And it's a recurring message, I think, with me. We have to enable the creativity of our private sector in the way we can. And I think the NAIR is really a platform or a resource to do that.
The Commission says that the United States should take steps now to cement its long-term status as a global leader in the design and manufacturing of quantum processing units. What kind of funding are you talking about? What size of funding? And how does that compare to funding currently available?
Yeah, I think, Craig, the thing that the Commission's really hitting on here is that we don't want to see a situation going forward that mirrors the microelectronics conversation that we're having to have nationally right now, where we largely lost our advantage in production to other nations around the world, where once we had it in the basic microelectronics space. We don't want to see that same thing occur in quantum. And you're right, the private sector and the government has invested heavily in quantum on the research side and the development side. I think we do lead probably in the design area and manufacturing, and we want to maintain that lead. So to avoid making the mistakes for quantum computers that we did for semiconductors, we've got to ensure that all our future advances in design and manufacturing of quantum processing units occur here in the United States. And in terms of the dollars, we really are recommending that Congress create a package of provisions that incentivize the domestic design and manufacturing here in the United States, with the goals of keeping a really vibrant ecosystem. And in terms of the levers that Congress has, well, I think the Commission really talks to tax credits for companies that are seeking to access quantum computers for business ops, and potentially things like loan guarantees could be utilized. And I would suggest even thoughtful equity financing for specific startups and companies that are doing unique things to advantage us in the quantum space. I don't think it's about a specific size at this point in time as much as it is we have a number of tools in the tool bag and we should bring them to bear on this challenge.
Does D-Wave, which is sort of the dominant manufacturer at this point of quantum computing systems, of early quantum computers, do they get government funding or tax breaks or something like that to encourage their research?
Well, full disclosure, In-Q-Tel is an investor in D-Wave. And so to the extent that In-Q-Tel invests on behalf of the United States national security community, yes, D-Wave has gotten money from the U.S. government. But they're not the only quantum computing company out there. There are companies like Rigetti, IonQ. The U.S. has got a vibrant quantum startup community, and I think we've got to nurture that.
Your line of effort recommends incentivizing private sector development of a domestic foundry, and this is for classical semiconductors. A foundry costs as much as $20 billion. I've had a conversation about this with Gilman Louie, another commissioner. What kind of funding does the commission recommend for a foundry?
I think that we've got to start by saying, why is this important? If you look at the United States right now, the innovation, the small company innovation, are really based on fabless semi companies. So you can think of them as design firms. And right now, these design firms in the microelectronics space have to go to merchant fabrication facilities offshore, the two dominant ones being TSMC and Samsung. And so really, if you start with our goal is really to bring that merchant fabrication capabilities back here to the United States to really turbocharge our startup community and our broader research and development community in the microelectronics space. The Commission is recommending tax incentives rather than publicly funding a foundry. So to us, we want to encourage others to build the foundry or to bring a foundry to the United States. A 40% tax credit on semi-manufacturing equipment and facilities in the U.S. through 2024 would probably do the trick and incentivize the private sector construction of a merchant fabrication facility here in the U.S. Specifically, tax incentives that were included in the Chips for America bill, introduced by Senators Warner and Cornyn over the summer, would do the trick. And really, I think that those sorts of things are very important, but they're not included in the NDAA right now that's under consideration on Capitol Hill. And I think that's probably something that should be revisited. The Chips for America bill, I think, was well-reasoned specifically around turbocharging the innovation engine in the United States and assuring that we have a lead going forward in the microelectronics space. We as a commission also recommended public R&D funding for microelectronics through DARPA. I think it makes great sense. Their Electronic Resurgence Initiative is a really, really good one. The National Science Foundation's got some efforts going on. And of course, DOE has got significant thought leadership in these areas. So we looked at a number of different places where incentives could be put in place and funding could go to really make sure that this notion of a merchant fab capacity spawning innovation was resonant here in the United States.
And with those credits, I mean, Samsung and TSMC are part of the backbone of our alliances with South Korea and Taiwan. Would those credits apply as well to foreign manufacturers if they're building foundries in the United States? I know TSMC is building a plant in Arizona, a foundry, I believe. And would that be taken into consideration that if you're reshoring so much of the microelectronic supply chain, you're not cutting off or hurting the allies that have relied on that expertise to build their economies?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a one or the other situation. I think if you look at the conversations going on with TSMC, they're predicated on the Chips for America Act and the tax incentives that would be put in place that make it viably economic for them to, as you put it, reshore to the United States. We are not for a second suggesting that they would need to close their plants in Taiwan or in South Korea if it were Samsung. We're suggesting that here in the United States, we have a substantial market in and of ourselves to consume the capacity that they would deliver here in the U.S. And just makes good sense for them to, if the economics can be balanced correctly, put their facilities here in the U.S.
Yeah, and I wasn't suggesting that they would close theirs. I'm just saying that a domestic U.S. foundry would supply a portion of the U.S. market that otherwise has to buy from Taiwan or South Korea. But then again, the demand for semiconductors is expanding exponentially right now, it seems. Your line of effort also makes several recommendations for tracing supply chains and reshoring critical elements in the microelectronics manufacturing chain. Would that include pushing for the domestic manufacture of extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, for which the U.S. now depends on the Netherlands, I believe?
I think that we have to understand that the supply chains for semiconductors, the tool sets and so on, are highly globalized. The globalized nature of the semiconductor industry really prohibits you from trying to reshore every single element of it. As you rightly point out, we are dependent on the Netherlands for some of the EUV technology, the lithography equipment that is so crucial. And I think that's fine. I think that it would be imprudent of us to try and reshore every element of the supply chain, especially where it's a point piece of the supply chain that we can consume from an ally. I think what we've got to do is we've got to look at sort of the critical elements and, more importantly, where they're going to advance over a period of time. One of the things that the Commission has recognized is that, for example, packaging is going to be very important going forward. In addition to the next generation of etching or deposition tools that may evolve, but the overall packaging environment is one that will differentiate semiconductors going forward. And so what we're suggesting is that tax credits and subsidies incentivize the U.S. firms that are really going to push the envelope on some of these new areas while still purchasing from our allies, where the allies have clear leads and differentiated products.
So the lithography equipment, I mean, that's another huge investment to develop that technology domestically. So you're not talking specifically about the lithography equipment that may remain with our allies.
Well, the beauty of tech, Craig, is that it moves fast. And so I think what I'd be asking is, what's the next generation of tool going to look like? How's the tools market going to get disrupted going forward? We want to incentivize U.S. startups and so on to try and do that. And I think that that is where the best bang for our buck could come.
That's interesting. It sounds like you're talking about something specific with regard to etching, are you?
Well, I think etching, deposition tech are areas that are ripe for disruption. When you look at the way microelectronics could evolve, we're seeing things like chiplets, which are little tiny processors that you put together in unique ways. We're seeing conversations about stackable technologies, in other words, layering things vertically as opposed to simply horizontally. And as you get into these new form factors, it's going to require new tools and, frankly, whole new ways of envisioning fabrication going forward. The U.S. has to do what the U.S. does best. We innovate well. And we've got to recognize that today our allies can provide unique capabilities and they innovate well in certain areas. But we've got to push the envelope. I think it was Wayne Gretzky's dad said, skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck is today. And I think that's what we've got to try and do. And I think that's what the Commission's trying to incentivize.
The Commission recommends empowering a single entity within the White House to strengthen executive leadership and tech policy. Where does that leadership reside now? And is the recommendation meant simply to raise the profile of tech in policy debates?
Well, this one's near and dear to my heart, Craig. As somebody that's grown up in tech in the private sector, we have a national security policy. We have a national economic policy. We have no national technology policy. And if the world goes the way I suspect it will, and biotech, for example, is the next revolution, we've got to craft a technology vision for this country and embark on an all-of-nation approach to realize that vision. And so my question is, who in the United States owns that? You've got the national economic community, you've got the national security community, you've got OSTP, but each deal with different parts of the U.S. technology policy question. And none of that really is coordinated from a tech perspective. And I would ask, where does it all come together? Where do we maximize our investments in a more unified way, recognizing the adjacencies that I referred to earlier? AI in and of itself is really only valuable as you talk to the adjacent technologies that it is going to disrupt. And so tech is central to strategic competition that we will have going forward, and you can't silo it. And so what the commission's really recommending is a tech competitiveness council to be chaired by the vice president and to be led by a newly created assistant to the president to really make sure that these different, very valuable entities doing tech work in the United States come together and align on a single, or at least on an agreed to, tech vision for the country.
That sounds very much like the American Technology Council that already exists, but failed to hold the interest of the tech community. If it's in the office of the executive, given the polarized nature of our politics today, how do you insulate that from politics? Maybe it should reside someplace other than the executive, is what I'm suggesting.
Well, I would suggest that when things get done in Washington, they get done at the executive level, because time is of the essence. This is not a problem that we can afford to stare at for decades as a nation. And we've seen that a VP level council, we saw it in space with NASA, it can be very, very effective. And I think it will be up to the vice president to make sure that the council is representative of a variety of different interests and political viewpoints, especially as we get into things like biotech, where clearly privacy and human rights and so on have a very significant role to play in the conversation. But we basically have to treat tech as a national security concern and as a national opportunity. If we can solve for health, if we can solve for food, if we can solve for environment, utilizing something like biotech, the United States should lead the world in that. Our population will be better off for it, and so will the global population. Look, these are serious times with serious challenges, as we've seen with this pandemic. We can't afford for politics or anything else to get in the way of us leading and solving these challenges. So the commission's recommendations, I think, are a good start.
This biodata thing really fascinates me because I understand the biowarfare threat, but I really hadn't thought of biodata as being the base for that threat.
It's a threat and it's an opportunity. And one of the things that, Craig, I'm trying to balance here is, as we've seen, national security is much more than kinetic event. The fact that Huawei is a proxy for aircraft carriers now being deployed around the world, and sometime is really the payload that they're delivering. Neither of those things is kinetic. And so bio's got to be viewed very similarly. It is something that can change lives, and it's also something that could be used against us if someone so desired.
Yeah. Chris, I do hope we have an opportunity to talk again another time, because this stuff is endlessly interesting. That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Chris for his time. If you want to learn more about the National Security Commission on AI, visit their website at www.nscai.gov. And remember, the singularity may not be near, but AI is about to change your world. So pay attention.